So good afternoon, everyone. And of course, good morning to those that are following us from the US. A very warm welcome to this policy dialogue. I'll just wait 30 seconds to give everyone the chance to connect, and then we'll start. Okay, I see that people are joining. So good afternoon again, and good morning to our US participants. So my name is Silvia Carta, and I'm a policy analyst at the European Policy Center, working in the European Migration and Diversity Program. I'm really delighted to be moderating today's online policy dialogue, where we look at the EU-US cooperation to address the needs of people displaced from Ukraine, and of course, jointly boost international solidarity. First of all, I would like to use this opportunity to thank our partners, the US mission to the European Union, for their excellent support in the preparation of this event. Before we start with the panel discussion, I would like to outline a few points. So first of all, last week marked 100 days since the war in Ukraine has started and since the Russian aggression. And over 7 million people have already crossed the border from Ukraine, of which 5 million are currently hosted across Europe, and mostly in EU member states. So you all know that Ukrainian refugees have been granted a blanket right to stay in the EU through the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, and almost 3 million have already registered as beneficiaries. However, as displacement and humanitarian needs continue to increase, international responsibility sharing will continue being of essence as the EU finds itself at the front line of an unprecedented displacement crisis. And in this context, of course, the United States, but also other transatlantic partners, such as Canada, committed to mobilize humanitarian relief, offer different forms of temporary protection, and also pledge to open admission channels for displaced Ukrainians. So this cooperation will be of essence, not only to address the needs of those fleeing Ukraine, but also to sustain the international system of solidarity and refugee protection. But against this background, I think that several challenges also need to be considered. And first of all, transatlantic cooperation, in order to be effective, needs smooth coordination and complementarity of efforts, both to the benefits of the people that are displaced, as well as towards the states that are hosting them. Secondly, all of the ambitious political choices that we have seen so far wouldn't have been possible without a positive political momentum and a welcoming attitude towards Ukrainians. But the continuation of these bottom-up efforts in the future is not to be taken for granted and needs to be sustained. So thirdly, and maybe more concretely, protection schemes offered to Ukrainians, both in the EU and in the US, are of temporary nature. So while this allows for responsiveness and flexibility, integration also needs to be planned from day one. And it will be important to think long-term so that refugees have continued support and also legal certainty as far as they need protection. And to conclude, but it is also a very important point, other global crises and refugees populations continue needing attention and support throughout the globe. So I'm thinking of people fleeing Afghanistan, but there are also many other conflicts and humanitarian emergencies that do not need to be overshadowed. So the response to the displacement from Ukraine will need to be accompanied by parallel efforts to uphold the international system of refugee protection. And with this in mind, both the EU and the United States have taken steps to address these issues. And both sides are now faced with the challenge of establishing a coherent approach, but also living up to the commitments to Ukrainians and refugee protection at large. And against this background, I'm finally very pleased to welcome our excellent set of speakers and to hear more about the EU's and the US's response to displacement from Ukraine so far, but also how these efforts could be strengthened, where increased cooperation is needed. And for this reason, I'm very pleased to welcome, first of all, Sarah Cross, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary at the US Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration. Secondly, Adam Hunter, who is also a Deputy Assistant Secretary but working in the US Department of Homeland Security. Thirdly, we have Giulio Blasi, who is a member of the Cabinet of Commissioner Johansson in the European Commission. And last but not least, Sophie Magennis, who is the Head of Policy and Legal Support at the UNHCR representation for EU Affairs in Brussels. So thanks to all for making the time to join us today. Before we begin, just a very few words on housekeeping. So the running order will be the following. First, the panelists will speak for maximum 7 minutes each. Then we will listen to some very short reactions from 2 respondents that I will present in a few minutes. And then we will have more than half an hour for an open Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can submit it already by using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please keep the questions as concise as possible so that we can have as many as we can. And of course, in the audience, we have people from many different backgrounds, and we have a lot of expertise also in the audience. So I really look forward to your active contribution. One last thing, the event is being recorded and it will be available online either this afternoon or tomorrow. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the first speaker. So welcome again to Deputy Assistant Secretary Sarah Cross, working in the US Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration. And thanks a lot for joining us today. So we'd be really grateful if you could touch upon the US's humanitarian efforts and response so far, cooperation with the EU, as well as the state of play of the US's resettlement plans vis-a-vis refugees from Ukraine. And the floor is yours for about 7 minutes. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Silvia. Can you hear me? Great. It's really a pleasure joining you today for this important exchange of ideas and information. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to discuss our efforts to respond to the nearly 7 million Ukrainian citizens and third country nationals who have fled Ukraine due to the unprovoked and unjustified war by Russia. In so many ways, the unity of our response to this crisis has been unprecedented. I'm here today with our good friends and colleagues to continue the close coordination with our European allies and partners who are on the forefront of this response, as well as the international organizations and NGOs who have been critical to our collective action in this humanitarian response to the war caused by Putin. I'd be remiss in not noting at the top that we're really proud that the United States is the largest single country donor of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and has provided more than $1 billion in humanitarian assistance since Russia first invaded Ukraine 8 years ago, including $688 million this year. Our assistance funding is primarily channeled through international organizations that are experts in responding to the needs of vulnerable people displaced by conflict. With our assistance, these organizations support and bolster the capacities of governments and non-governmental organizations, international and local, to ensure all refugees have access to international protection and receive urgently needed aid and support. But humanitarian assistance is just one critical component of this response. We have watched with humility and awe the very generous and extraordinary outpouring of hospitality by so many European nations, from frontline states to those in the West increasingly becoming a destination for war-weary Ukrainians. Europeans across the continent have welcomed millions of vulnerable individuals, the majority of whom are women and children, with open arms. We applaud this tremendous welcome by Ukraine's neighbors in accepting and providing care for its refugees. We're especially impressed by the outpouring of support from local organizations and host countries, which have taken additional steps in offering temporary protection mechanisms that allow refugee integration into state welfare systems, as well as the right to seek employment and access to healthcare, childcare, education, and housing programs. The kindness and generosity that residents of these countries have shown to refugees is truly extraordinary. We're grateful for the hard work of the Commission, including and especially our colleagues at DG Home. Before the first shots were fired, the Commission and the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom were already cooperating to prepare for the worst. From detailed discussions of where refugees would flee and how quickly they would move, to the critical activation of the unprecedented Temporary Protection Directive, we've been working together on a comprehensive response for months. I have no doubt that the groundwork we laid in those early days, cooperation that paved the way for continuing partnerships, really saved lives. But the conflict continues, and we must continue to adapt to changing circumstances and mounting needs. We must consider the present circumstances, but also the near-term and long-term potential protection needs. The State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration is preparing its response to the recently revised and released humanitarian flash appeal and the regional refugee response plan, which provides both the programmatic and the budgetary basis for assisting those who are both currently displaced and potential new flows of Ukrainian refugees in Europe. In addition to providing humanitarian assistance, as we think about the medium and long-term response, we're also considering how we can expand access to the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, or what we call USRAP. USRAP is a permanent resettlement pathway to the United States managed by the Department of State through my bureau, PRM. Through this program, we accept referrals from UNHCR and U.S. embassies, certified NGOs, and others who are for those who are determined to be most vulnerable and in need of the protection that third country resettlement can provide. Resettlement from Ukraine to the United States over the last several decades has primarily been conducted through the Lautenberg program, which allows members of certain religious minority groups from the former Soviet Union to reunite with family members in the United States. Although we have temporarily suspended our operations in Kyiv, we continue to process Lautenberg cases out of Chisinau, Moldova, and are in the process of opening a new office in Warsaw, Poland. We've prioritized outreach to Ukrainian applicants who have fled Ukraine and have already completed their mandatory refugee interviews. This helps ensure that those who are most ready for departure can be processed quickly, regardless of their location. Ukrainian Lautenberg refugees have already been resettled from Germany, Moldova, Poland, and Romania. We've resettled nearly 1,000 from Ukraine through the Lautenberg program this year, and over the past 5 fiscal years, we've resettled 14,000 Ukrainians through this program. Recognizing that many Ukrainian citizens want to return home when it is safe to do so, we anticipate that those who are most likely to have an interest in permanent resettlement to the United States will be those with family or other close ties in the United States, as well as those third country nationals, including citizens of the Russian Federation or Belarus, who cannot find safety or feel that they need further protection in the US. With this in mind, we've also begun looking beyond the Lautenberg program to explore additional refugee referral mechanisms to the USRAP in Europe. Establishing new mechanisms will require expanding our efforts in European countries where we have historically not had robust operations, including in Poland. To be clear, establishing resettlement operations in new areas takes time and requires that we create even deeper partnerships with both the EU and its member states. We're committed to working with our allies in the months ahead to identify how our program can best complement the multiple existing lines of efforts, both within the EU and with our friends in the UK and Canada. Of course, resettlement is only one piece of the larger effort, and my colleague Adam will speak more about the Department of Homeland Security's new Uniting for Ukraine program that provides a temporary protection pathway to those in the United States who qualify. Before I close, I want to underline the importance of our mutual cooperation. We value immensely, our longstanding partnership with our European allies and will continue to bolster cooperation and strengthen our engagement on refugee resettlement and humanitarian assistance more broadly in the context of the crisis in Ukraine. Alongside Canada and the UK, we have recently participated in several iterations of the EU's expanded solidarity platform. And through this platform, we will look forward to eventually receiving input from member states on particularly vulnerable groups or individuals that may need access to USRAP. We're also working closely with the EU Commission and member states to support Commissioner Johansson's leadership as she continues to advocate for member states to respond robustly to global humanitarian needs. Sustainable and predictable contributions over time to humanitarian assistance and to refugee resettlement, including sponsorship programs, will be vital. In our ongoing partnership with the EU and our other allies, we hope to continue the work that we have started with the Commission and with member states to support global resettlement goals more broadly. Through the leadership of the Commission and the European Union Asylum Agency, we will continue identifying safe protection pathways, for example, for vulnerable Afghans who are also in need of protection pathways. And we will contribute our unique US perspectives, including the best and worst of our practices. And we will work with the European Union Asylum Agency and our Canadian colleagues to continue our resettlement visits program. Our renewed engagement on the US-EU migration platform has also come at a pivotal moment. Its second meeting took place this past Tuesday, and we were really heartened by the frank and open and constructive conversations that took place during that dialogue. And we look forward to the conversations in that and other forums, such as the Intergovernmental Consultations on Migration, Asylum and Refugees, and the OECD. Silvia, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this important topic during this event. I very much look forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say and to the discussion that comes thereafter. Thanks very much.
Thanks to you for this contribution. You already touched upon a lot of different issues that I hope we will be able to come back to throughout the discussion. But in particular, of course, you've mentioned resettlement, and you rightly said that the US has not only admitted Ukrainians through resettlement programs, but actually also launched the United for Ukraine initiative, which we will hear from also from your colleague. So welcome again to Adam Hunter, who is a Deputy Assistant Secretary from the US Department of Homeland Security that has been, of course, administering the rollout of Uniting from Ukraine. And this program is actually set to admit several thousand Ukrainians in the next few months. And we would be really curious to know more about this initiative, but also on the role of private sponsorship as one of its key components. So over to you for 7 minutes as well.
Thank you, Silvia, and good afternoon, panelists and colleagues who are joining today. It's my pleasure to be with you. I think Sarah's lead-in on behalf of the Department of State is a very good one, because we do bring complementary tools that are united in the effort to support Ukrainians, displaced Ukrainians, and others to whom we have been so awe-inspired at their fortitude and resilience in the face of this unprovoked invasion by Russia these past several months. On the Department of Homeland Security side, there's a couple of key things within our authorities that we have done. First, we have provided temporary protected status to Ukrainians who are in the United States, and they needed to have been in the United States as of April 11th. This is a long-standing authority that we have used over the past decades that provides a relief and reprieve from removal and allows people, whether they are here with a temporary status or no status at all, to be able to remain for a period of 18 months and have access to legal employment authorization so they can work legally. Temporary protected status is based on certain statutory conditions and country conditions review, and that is a process that we then will re-review, and there is the option to both extend and redesignate Ukraine for temporary protected status, again, for the people who are already here. And then Silvia, as you and Sarah have mentioned, we launched a new process on April 25th called Uniting for Ukraine. Lots of information is available on our website, dhs.gov/Ukraine. You will find a lot of information and frequently asked questions there. And this is a complementary tool and a significant one at that to some of the pathways that Sarah outlined. So while there are those in need of permanent resettlement and having acute protection needs, there's a lot of other individuals that we understand are in seek of temporary safe haven, have an intention to return home. And for these populations, having this parole pathway, and this is a different authority, this is an authority vested with the Secretary of Homeland Security that provides for a temporary stay in the United States and also does allow for work authorization. But it is not, it has its limitations, it is not a permanent pathway in the manner that resettlement is or that lawful permanent residence is. But what we were able to do using this authority and using some advancements that we have developed internally and some creative partnerships, and based on the particular circumstances of Ukrainians and their passports and other access to identity documents, we were able to design a process that is significant and new in two key respects. One is that it is a kind of demand-driven process that is initiated by US-based supporters. So these supporters in the US could be Ukrainians' family members, extended family members, former college roommates, business associates, or anyone who has a Ukrainian beneficiary in a very wide berth who they are seeking to individually support. they have to file what's called a declaration of financial support. So it's really about an assessment for suitability of financial support to provide for the intended Ukrainian beneficiary. What we are also doing up front is encouraging groups to come together, right? It does not need to be the evidence and the financial burden of any one individual, but it could be an individual that's representing a small group. It could also be an individual that is representing support from an organization, a business, a donor fund, or other types of financial mechanisms that can help in that process. The other key thing that we've done that is novel here and very novel in our immigration context is that we are not using paper. This is an electronic and online process, soup to nuts. So it is allowing, again, that initial filing from the US-based supporter, providing also information on their intended Ukrainian beneficiary. Ukrainians themselves will get notification to access an online account, to verify biographic details, to attest to completing requirements such as vaccination requirements, and to send the case for processing. Once approved, Ukrainians then receive to their accounts notice that they are electronically authorized to travel. So they are granted authorization to travel to the United States for purposes of seeking parole at a port of entry. They need no further documentation in their passport. They do not have to visit a US embassy or consulate overseas. That electronic notification is visible to airlines in our systems, and they can book a commercial flight, board, and travel to their final destination. So because of that, this entire process, of course, understanding that there are elements that the supporter needs to provide the evidence, the Ukrainian needs to set up their own account and actually move their cases forward. But if all those steps unfold quickly, someone could be between application and booking their travel within a couple of weeks. So it is designed to be a very quick process and provide that more emergency, that urgent humanitarian reprieve for individuals to come to the United States and have that period of stay with individuals to whom they have ties. We've been open on this process, as I mentioned, since April 25th, which is just about 6 weeks. We've had just north of 50,000 applications in so far. And we have just over 30,000 Ukrainians, or in some instances, they're non-Ukrainian immediate family members who are authorized today to travel to the United States, and just about 9,000 have already arrived. So of course, once they're authorized to travel, then it's incumbent upon them to choose their own routes and make those bookings. But so far, about 9,000 have arrived, and we have been seeing steady interest. We've been hovering right about 1,300 new applications each and every day in a very, very steady pace for the several weeks that we have been in operation. Also, very recently, in just the past couple of weeks, the president signed new legislation that was passed by Congress that allows access to certain public means tested benefits, as well as federal support as if these Ukrainian entrants were refugees. So that is allowing new partnerships to form between our agency and the responsible agency at Health and Human Services, and through our state governments that are on the front lines of providing support and assistance and access to benefits for these Ukrainians. And I know I'm over time, but I touched a little bit on the kind of private element on the supporter, which is such a really exciting model that we are kind of testing out in this conceptually, because we have programs for which we can facilitate reunification for immediate family members, and using this type of model of a supporter-based program that is really wide in how we're looking at who can support, and really tapping in to the sense of interest and welcome and generosity of Americans and not yet Americans of all stripes all around the country. We're seeing supporters from all 50 states and a really wide distribution. I think is going to be a really exciting series of lessons learned that we're going to be monitoring closely, and we hope can translate to interest also in the resettlement, in the permanent resettlement context in short order. So I will leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Many thanks. All of these elements are extremely interesting, especially this innovative component of Uniting for Ukraine. I think we'll be talking about it also as a model in Europe and try to see, of course, what are the positive aspects that can also be taken forward potentially. And of course, our next speaker, maybe not in his current role, but in the previous one, as the director of the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative, during the Q&A, we'll also have something to say from the European perspective. But I'm now very pleased to hand over to him, Giulio de Blasi, who is now member of the cabinet of Commissioner Ylva Johansson at the European Commission. And we are very pleased to welcome you back to the EPC. So, of course, the European Commission, as we've heard also from our US guests, has been very proactive in encouraging not only a rapid response to the events in Ukraine, but also really leveraging international cooperation. So what can you tell us about these initiatives, such as the Solidarity Platform, for example, and the areas in which the EU actually would require support from partners? And of course, I think that another very important question, since in these few months we have seen millions of people coming to the EU and receiving protection, which is something that until a few months ago, I think none of us would have believed. Actually, how could this have consequences on the EU's commitments to international solidarity in the long term? And how could this impact also resettlement from other regions? So I know you only have 7 minutes and it is quite large, but then hopefully in the Q&A we can come back on the specific points. So over to you, Giulio, and many thanks for joining.
Thank you, Silvia. And it's such a pleasure to be on the panel with so many good friends and allies. And thanks for organizing this session. I would start with one reflection that one of the reasons I accepted this invitation is because I think it is very timely to reflect how all that is happening with Ukraine, but actually how all that was already happening with Afghanistan is cementing a new potential collective work and partnership on a transatlantic level around refugee protection, be it resettlement, call it temporary protection in the context of Europe, but what is really a common mark around this is really how this is creating new potentials for cooperation. And sometimes I'm qualifying this in a bit of a maybe overambitious way, but in both cases, it feels to me almost as if there would be one single large protection space that we are extending to our friends, allies, and persons that are being displaced by crisis, both in Afghanistan and Ukraine. I think it's really, really revelatory of something that I hope we can keep for the long term. And this is not just cooperation in words, it's cooperation in practice. And that will lead me easily to start answering your first question around the Solidarity Platform. I've been going through several crises in my 12 years tenure in the European Commission and outside. And never before I've seen such a unity of purpose, again, both within the European Union and outside the European Union. And that unity of purpose is reflected, I think, on two levels. First was the absolutely impossible to think in advance activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, not just at qualified majority, but actually at unanimity. I think we should always remember that that is a milestone in the level of trust in the Council that we have not reached for a long time, and something that has actually created the fundamental building block for the actual operational work to be as successful. You would not have had the Solidarity Platform and everything that descended from it without having that initial very strong collective and unified political impetus. But from there, I think we moved very, very, very well to the operational response. And it's an operational response. I mean, I don't think the EU level should take all the credit. In previous responses at times, it felt a little bit like the EU was on the front line. I think here member states are on the front line and we help with support and coordination. And that's really what the Solidarity Platform is about. And it's incredibly exciting to see how the participation to the Solidarity Platform, if anything, is improved and increased throughout time. Historically, with this kind of forum that we set up at the European level, you see them start up at the highest level with everyone very excited and then slowly drag down because they don't manage to be effective. I think if anything, we are seeing the opposite trend with the Solidarity platform. The ability to really establish itself more and more as a crucial point of exchange and cooperation, and one that really is able, I think, to provide a governing body or a coordination body for a collective space of protection that we have created with the Temporary Protection Directive. And the challenges are enormous. I mean, I would say we managed to have an immediate strong response thanks to the 10-point plan on Ukraine that we adopted in the Council on the 28th of May. But now moving ahead, we need to look well beyond what are the immediate migration responses and start to look at which are the societal responses. And by societal responses, I think here about integrating into the education system. I think here about the labor market in the context where millions on the move are women with children and require childcare in order to be really able to access the labor market. I'm thinking here about health access. I'm thinking here about what Adam and Sarah were touching upon, which is the incredible experience with private homes being open to persons who are in need of protection, that of course have been opened in an élan of solidarity, as we would say it in French, but in a very unstructured way. So colleagues across the Atlantic, maybe that is a bit of a difference from us, colleagues across the Atlantic and across the channel had the luxury of setting the policies for opening the homes. In Europe, it was really an immediate reaction for people that were just pouring across the border. And of course, now we need to catch up with the policy. We need to have the policy catch up with reality rather than setting up the policy to govern reality, which is always, it's very exciting, of course, and at the same time is a challenge. So these areas of education, accommodation, labor market, and overall a fundamental question around the terms that we normally use in migration management, terms like integration or return, how do they apply in the context of the current displacement? Because they apply very differently from what we have been learning in previous refugee crises. So these are, I think, the big questions. I think we have been able to answer the very well, both in terms of coordination and in terms of short-term operations. And now we have ahead large political and operational challenges ahead that need to reply to those four fundamental areas. And again, in all of this, cooperation across the Atlantic will be fundamental. As we are designing this sort of collective protection space in the response to Ukraine, decisions that are taken in one country reverberate in another in a way that has never been as real before. If one country decides to use and school persons in a certain way, it will reverberate how others will be doing it. So we really need to maintain this very strong level of coordination that we have been establishing in the past few months. And most importantly, I really hope we can maintain it for the future. And that would be the last part of what I wanted to flag. So there has been a lot of people that have been saying Ukraine is a unique crisis and the response is unique. Ukraine has some uniquenesses. I'm deeply convinced about it, as every crisis has its own uniquenesses. Just to give an example, this is a war of aggression. We have not been seeing a war of aggression generating refugee flows for a very long time. We are accustomed to civil war, internal strife, hybrid wars, but a pure 19th century war of aggression, it was a long time we've not been seeing it. And clearly this is unique. This makes this a bit unique compared to others. But at the same time, there are some trends that I think we can bring along to the future. And one of these trends is clearly for me, what are we doing? What have we been able to do by opening private homes and community sponsorship, and what Sarah and Adam were talking about before? I think one of the key testimonies to show that this is not just a reaction to Ukraine, but is something bigger, is to be able to translate some of this solidarity for the future for other refugee population. So that certainly is one of the things that is on top of my mind. A second one is, as I was saying, the international cooperation. I think we started it already for some time. We had the high-level resettlement forum with US, UK, European Union, and other partners, and this reinforces it. And we need to continue along the same route and think about which governing models and modalities can be generated by this cooperation. And I think the third layer for me is also to reflect about crisis response and the future of temporary protection at the European level and our crisis response systems. but also a bit the uniqueness of this crisis, which has been to provide significant agencies to people to decide and to match with between sponsors and between refugees and welcomers, and how this agency can translate in the programs that we're going to set up in the future. In all of this, we are working actively. We're working actively around what is called the Safe Homes Initiative that we announced in March this year, which really aims to institutionalize part of this response. And we're working actively, I hope, more and more by cooperating with our US, Canadian, UK, and other friends in the context of the Solidarity Platform and beyond.
Many thanks also for connecting the dots between the first two interventions and what the EU has been doing. And I think that your ideas around a single space of protection are quite interesting. And of course, having Sophie Magennis from UNHCR speaking after you fits very well, as I guess that she will be able to provide also the view of the UN Refugee Agency about this changing, as you said, terms of migration and refugee realities following the war in Ukraine, but also, of course, how can we translate these supports for protecting people fleeing Ukraine to support for other refugee situations in the future. And with this, I'll hand over to Sophie Magennis for 7 minutes. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Silvia, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for having UNHCR here. And like other speakers have commented on, it's very timely that the EPC has organized this event with partners here. We've recently marked 2 big milestones. One is 100 days of the war in Ukraine, and the other is reaching the milestone of 100 million people forcibly displaced around the globe. So I think taking this moment to reflect on where we are at this session is very welcome. I was asked to speak a little bit about how UNHCR has been involved in priority and response planning to the situation both inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine since the invasion started. I think on priority setting, it's important to remember that as UNHCR, together with our partners, we've come up with regional response plans. So plans both for the response in refugee hosting countries in the EU, and also plans for our response inside Ukraine. And these are the plans where we set out what our funding requirements are and where we rely so heavily on the partners who are here today to help us to fund those plans. So through those, we've set out our priorities, and in Ukraine, they focus very much on providing cash assistance to people who've been displaced within the country, providing items that people will need who've been displaced, providing information and other supports. And so far, since the 24th of February, we have, together with our partners, assisted over 1.2 million across Ukraine. Turning to the neighboring countries, our role there is very much to support the member states of the European Union and to support Moldova, who are leading in the response to the refugees arriving in their country. There again, we focus a lot on cash assistance. We have enrolled over 180,000 refugees for cash assistance in Moldova, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia. Those are our enrollment data as of the end of May. We provide information and protection at sites like the Blue Dots, which we've established 34 of. These are these places where women and families and children can go to get additional supports. And also in Moldova, we have, together with our partners, the Moldovan authorities and also IOM, with great coordination support from the European Commission, we are assisting and operating a transfer program for refugees out of Moldova to other states in the European Union. This air transfer program has transferred by air over 1,400 refugees since it started. It's working well. There is, of course, more that we need to do to enhance the uptake of that program, but we also find that many refugees who are in Moldova at the moment are still waiting to see how things will evolve in Ukraine with the prospect of possibly returning. In addition to all of this planning and priority setting we've been doing ourselves and with partners, We've benefited enormously from the Solidarity platform that Giulio has spoken about, set up and coordinated by the Commission. And it's really been great to see the USA, Canada and UK attending those meetings and providing important leadership and support to EU member states and giving a sense of the international partnership that is available. It really has been incredibly important. And one of the things that we found very useful with the Solidarity platform, I think, as you say, Giulio, is that its importance has grown over time. And actually the platform is focusing on really important things that need to be done. So a focus at the moment is on contingency planning. There, the Commission has been receiving information from all EU member states on what they are planning to do for a range of scenarios. And that's been an opportunity for us as UNHCR and IOM to work very closely with member states and plan together in coordination to plan for different contingencies. I was also asked to address the question of how we can build on protection for Ukrainian refugees and expand protection and pathways for all refugees globally. I think on the pathways for Ukrainians, we greatly welcome the initiatives that the United States, Canada and the UK have brought forward, and we publicly welcome those programs. And it's really good to hear both from Sarah and Adam today on how those programs are working and the implementation rollout. So that's really, really great to see. And as UNHCR also, we've been engaging with our colleagues in the administrations in the USA and Canada to see what potential there might be for us if we come across people in our work with family and other connections to those countries to perhaps assist in some kind of referrals to yourselves as well. In addition to those initiatives, it's really important for us to maintain the focus on global resettlement. And again, we've been working very closely with partners in USA, Canada, and donors in the EU, and particularly Norway, Denmark, and other donors, to rebuild capacity post-COVID in resettlement capacity and to try and get resettlement admissions globally back on track. So, for example, for this year, UNHCR has called on EU member states to admit 36,000 refugees. So 36,000 refugees globally into the EU this year. And we've also called for an additional admission of Afghan refugees over the next 5 years. We have a target there of 42,500 admission of Afghan refugees over the next 5 years. So we really hope to build on momentum together with our partners to see if we can get the numbers of admissions up, because they have been remaining low. And it's important also to note, I think, that the other programs that we're looking at on transfers for Ukrainians, but also humanitarian transfers of Afghans, that those kind of programs remain additional to the resettlement intake, so that we can keep those important programs alive. And then just finally, I was also asked to reflect briefly on the longer term prospects for the integration of refugees from Ukraine in the EU and beyond. And certainly, the fact that temporary protection, which is an excellent model, and it's wonderful that it was proposed by the Commission and agreed to by EU member states, it is of course time bound. And that does have some considerations, for example, for people planning to join the labour force or enroll children in school. But there's also the uncertainty about the situation in Ukraine. And many families are waiting to see whether they will fully invest in their lives in the country where they are, or whether they will go back. So we have these uncertainties, and perhaps the best that we can do is focus on what I think the OECD terms dual intent activities when it comes to integration, that the investment in integration of Ukrainian refugees in the EU will be an investment for their lives while they're in the EU, but also equip them with skills with a perspective of return. So I think we can try and enhance both integration and support return at the right time by making sure that we invest in integration for itself. Also, just briefly on community sponsorship and welcoming communities, and there I'll end because I'm out of time. I think Giulio's touched on it very well, the need to try and build on and sustain what's been developed. And we greatly welcome this Safe Homes initiative that has been advanced by the Commission, and look forward to engaging with that to try and build on what has been achieved in these dramatic times in Europe. Thanks very much.
Thanks to you for also touching upon a lot of different issues that are all, however, very important in this conversation. But in order not to take too much time to the Q&A, I will immediately move forward to our respondents. And I see that some questions are already coming through the Q&A tool, and I would ask you to keep posting them so that we do not, let's say, miss the opportunity to ask them to the speakers. But now I'm very happy to also hand over to two expert respondents that have very kindly agreed to join us today. So we will start with Mary Coulter, who is a counselor on migration at the mission of Canada to the EU. And of course, we've heard a lot on the EU's and the US's perspective so far, but Canada is also taking measures to facilitate the arrivals of refugees from Ukraine. And of course, we would be really grateful to know more about these efforts and the Canadian perspective to transatlantic cooperation. So over to you, Mrs. Coulter, and of course, you have around 3 to 4 minutes. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Silvia. Merci beaucoup. And thanks to the US mission to the EU for inviting me today. I'd like to start by thanking you for your insights and also thanking you for your action. There's been an incredibly quick and impactful response to Russia's unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine. We've seen immense efforts towards protection of millions of forcibly displaced persons. As Giulio said, really swift, historic, and unanimous activation of the temporary protection directive needs to be acknowledged, as does the significant and the innovative actions by the US in terms of support. So thank you for that. I also want to highlight the UNHCR's efforts in scaling up and also recognize the dangers faced by humanitarian workers in Ukraine. As Sophie mentioned, the assistance to 1.2 million individuals across Ukraine is remarkable, and thank you for that. I'll speak briefly to Canada's response to displacement. Canada launched the Canada-Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel in March. This is an expedited pathway to Canada that provides stay for up to 3 years to those who need it. Individuals can still also access work and study permits. Children are able to attend school. There's a number of key services that are associated with this pathway. And I should remark that it's uncapped. So we accept a limitless number of applications. What that means is since June 1st, or at June 1st, we have received over 278,000 authorization applications and approved over 127,000. Close to 40,000 Ukrainians have arrived in Canada since the start of the calendar year till May 30th. I should flag that we are also introducing a special family reunification sponsorship pathway for those who would like to stay on in Canada on a permanent basis, and that is being developed now. In terms of travel to Canada, I want to raise 2 points. The first is our partnership on what we call the Ukraine to Canada Travel Fund, and that allows Canadians and Canadian companies to donate frequent flyer or Aeroplan points with the objective of bringing 10,000 Ukrainians and their families to Canada. Our Prime Minister announced at the Stand Up for Ukraine event in April that he was securing charter flights for those needing help traveling to Canada. And so far, we've had 3 charter flights arrive into Winnipeg, Montreal, and Nova Scotia. I want to, highlight something that Adam said earlier, just the importance of support, the importance of welcome. Giulio made reference to this. The work of the settlement sector in Canada has been mobilized. We've established national governance table to help coordinate settlement efforts, which I think is really worth highlighting. The donations, the offers of housing coming in. I also want to acknowledge the work of the Canadian Red Cross, who is providing reception services at international airports in Toronto and Edmonton and Vancouver. And again, offering a range of services, including mental health and medical assistance, among others. Really important to speak about the response to Ukraine, but I think also important to recognize, as we have, that we continue to roll out or operate our traditional resettlement programs, including the response to Ukraine, or the transition of power in Ukraine, and the resultant displacement. Over the next 3 years, Canada intends to resettle nearly 140,000 individuals, including Afghan nationals. I should point out, of course, that this does not include the work that we're doing with Ukraine on the temporary authorization. I think, what I see in terms of the high-level resettlement forum, in terms of the solidarity platform, in terms of the work that we're doing together for European Union Agency for Asylum's export platform on safe pathways for Afghans, is just this growing solidarity and cooperation upon which we're now able to build. So Giulio, you were saying that really eloquently, and I think it's important to come back to that, extremely important. I want to talk to something. Sarah mentioned this. Sarah Cross mentioned some of the work that we've been doing with the US mission to the EU, and also EU and EU member states around resettlement operations. So we did take, for example, and this is a point I'm making to highlight sort of this cooperations that's been strengthened over the past year amongst the group that is here today. Having taken the opportunity to highlight our respective models, resettlement operations models, challenges and opportunities in this case in Kenya. And it was in that environment that we were able again to advance discussions about how we could work together in the resettlement space. In that particular trip, Canada had the opportunity to highlight work we were doing on a new pilot. This was in 2019, so the Economic Mobility Pathways pilot. In short, it's a program that recognizes the skills and abilities of refugees and allows them and their families to immigrate to Canada through existing economic programs. So one example, where we worked together in the past, we've built that cohesion and solidarity, I think, that is assisting us today. And in that respect, with regard to that program, 3 years on, Canada is leveraging its experience in a new role as chair of the recently launched Global Task Force on Refugee Labor Mobility. So another opportunity for us to work together. I should point out that this multi-stakeholder forum, the Global Task Force, whose mission is to improve refugee access to protection through complementary pathways, again, is another example of where we might work together moving forward. So to close, I'd just like to say that Canada is dedicated to the promotion of the United Nations Global Compact on Refugees, and particularly the third objective of expanding refugee access to third country solutions, including the promotion of complementary pathways for admission of refugees. Most recently, we chaired a MERP support platform in Canada, and we had the opportunity during a signature event to exchange information and good practices around ideas for solutions and expanded admission channels for refugees. We look forward to continued transatlantic solidarity and innovation in responding to displacement from Ukraine, in global refugee resettlement, and in building and scaling new complementary pathways that will allow us to do even more to help some of the millions of displaced persons around the world. So thank you for the opportunity to bring a Canadian perspective, and thank you to you all.
Many thanks to you, and of course, many thanks also for again pointing to the fact that a lot of different platforms and instruments of cooperation already existed prior, of course, to the war in Ukraine, but now we are really seeing how all of these instruments can be effective, and I think this is a very important point to remember. But now, before the Q&A, I will move to our final respondents. So Imogen Sudbury, the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the International Rescue Committee. So she will be bringing, of course, the NGO perspective and in particular IRC's view. And IRC is active not only in the EU, but also in the US, and is working on the ground in Poland and Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken. So it would be really interesting to hear your reaction to the input from the panel, but also whether you see any gaps in the response so far, and whether you have any recommendation that you would like to highlight from your perspective.
Thank you so much, Silvia. It's a real pleasure to be part of this very interesting discussion and timely, as many of the other speakers have mentioned. I would like to start by thanking the European Commission, the US and Canadian administrations for what's been a very strong political commitment demonstrated to refugees fleeing Ukraine. Our teams on both sides of the Atlantic have really strongly welcomed what speakers today here have repeatedly called an unprecedented response, characterized by creative solutions like the EU triggering the Temporary Protection Directive and the US's United for Ukraine effort, but more generally by collective resolve, innovation, rapid funding and strong interagency work. The needs, of course, remain substantial, and today's speakers have really highlighted some of the key shared challenges where strong transatlantic cooperation will still be critical to addressing the needs. To summarize some of these briefly, I would highlight firstly the need for sufficient and continued investment, and in particular concrete mechanisms, which hasn't been touched on so much as I might have expected in the discussion so far, to ensure that funding reaches beyond the central level, really to the local authorities and civil society respondents that are very much at the forefront of leading the response. Secondly, the need's been highlighted, of course, to address the pressures that are on neighbouring countries, and particularly the housing shortages and overcrowding that our teams are witnessing. So we've heard how new US and the Canadian programs, as well as active participation in the Solidarity platform, can help alleviate these responsibilities. But the challenge, of course, remains that many people are understandably reluctant to take up these opportunities and move too far from Ukraine. So to address this and increase uptake, we would recommend on the EU side that really addressing some of the information challenges so that people have sufficient knowledge and understanding of the rights available to them in different countries, and ideally can retain their status if they move between different countries as well. Well, on the US side, our teams are also keen to urge continued investment into establishing pathways to permanent resident status, as the current lack of status available through humanitarian parole may also act as a disincentive to people coming. A third challenge that's been identified today is, of course, the need to ensure, as we do really expand quite rapidly the community protection and the community and private sponsorship initiatives, that there is rigorous safeguarding and protection measures accompanying this. So in the EU, where the rapid emergency needs remain pressing, it's vital that governments put in place comprehensive plans to implement EU guidelines and also to minimise the risks of trafficking, exploitation and abuse. Finally, I can only reiterate the critical importance of ensuring an inclusive, equitable and non-discriminatory approach to refugees of all nationalities, which again has been great to hear so many speakers speaking about today. So it's not just Ukrainians who receive the response that they need to their protection needs, but also people of all nationalities fleeing the country. Then beyond this kind of quite brief summary of challenges, I wanted to bring the conversation back full circle to Silvia's introduction, and to conclude by noting that we're really reaching a critical turning point in some of the broader implications of the response for people affected by other crises around the world. And perhaps to inject a note of caution into what's been a very refreshingly upbeat conversation, and rightly so. But I feel like depending on the choices that we make now, the Ukraine response could really either trigger a downward spiral or a new beginning in terms of global refugee protection. So on the one hand, in IRC, we're alert to the very real risk that the response to Ukrainians leads to a sense of fatigue, with states really turning attention and funding away from refugees fleeing other crises. And this would really include the important ambitions to significantly expand refugee resettlement and fully uphold asylum systems. This would be a grave mistake at a time when global needs, of course, continue to grow and are indeed rising rapidly in other regions as a direct response to the Ukraine crisis. On the flip side, the response, as we've touched on today, has really demonstrated clearly that not only is it eminently possible to welcome large numbers of refugees without any sense of chaos or crisis, but also that done right, this can bring very clear benefits to host communities. In particular, easing documentation requirements, fast-tracking status recognition, and rapidly mobilizing funding has enabled us to almost entirely avoid the kind of backlogs, overcrowding, and protracted camp situations, which have been so damaging for refugees fleeing other crises and conflicts and their integration prospects. In fact, the exciting point is that this response, as Giulio mentioned, also the Afghan response as well, is full of innovative thinking and learnings that really could and should provide the underpinnings and new momentum and inspiration for a more fair, humane, and coordinated global deal for displaced people, delivered through transatlantic leadership, structured dialogue, and a move towards what Giulio termed the shared protection space. And again, as was touched on earlier, I would also flag the upcoming EU pledging cycle for resettlement that will kick off in July as one quickly approaching critical moment to kick off this effort with high levels of ambition. So I'll end on that more optimistic note that we seize this moment of opportunity to really reset the global refugee response, learn from what's worked this time, and chart a better way forward, not just for Ukrainians, but for all those in search of protection.
Many thanks to you too. This was really, I think, again, comprehensive, but also important to have a bit of also cautionary note to conclude and to maybe deepen the discussion a little bit, to have the different perspective at the table, because as you said, this is certainly a turning point. I mean, of course, for these first 3 months, the response has been unimaginable. But now what we really want to see in the future is how this can be sustained. So I'm really positive after hearing all of the speakers today, but I also realize it's extremely important to continue also asking questions and especially questioning decision makers and continuing to bring the perspectives of people working on the ground in particular. But now we still have half an hour, and I apologize for going a bit over time with the panel, but I think that all of the speakers had extremely interesting and insightful remarks to make, and also very different perspectives. So without further ado, I see that there are already a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I invite the audience to continue posting them. So I will maybe take 2 to 3 at a time so that the speakers can then reply according to their expertise, of course. So I wouldn't necessarily go in the same order as we did in the first panel, but then just feel free to come in unless, of course, the question is specifically directed to you, as it is the case, of course, of the first question. Deputy Assistant Secretary Hunter and Cross both mentioned the resettlement and sponsoring initiatives that have been initiated in the US for Ukrainian refugees. And one of the members of the audience also asks whether these are open to non-Ukrainian refugees from other crisis contexts. So, for example, from the African continent, and what is being done not to forget other crises and causes of refugee flows. So I think that this is partly to the US side of the panel, but then, of course, the broader question to everyone else. Then I've seen that we also have a question a bit more specifically on, of course, cooperation with Hungary, even if that falls maybe in the broader framework of cooperation with the EU in general, and the fact that Hungary also benefits from temporary protection, and the fact that people can move freely and not necessarily stay in its territory. But then, of course, if any of the speakers has anything that they would like to add, feel free to do so. And then I would also have a question myself, because I feel that one of the topics that have really been hinted at several times throughout the discussion has been innovation and creativity, because we have seen that the crisis in Ukraine has prompted a set of new responses and policies that were designed and also implemented in a very short amount of time, or as actually Giulio noted, in the case of Europe, now needs to be designed around the situation on the ground. But in your view, how much of this response has been based on the lessons learned from previous crises, for example, Afghanistan, and also to what extent this innovation component has been due to these new forms of cooperation? I'm thinking, for example, of this digitalized process that the US have introduced in their sponsorship initiatives that really reminds me of the COVID processing that has been used for resettlement during the pandemic. So I would be curious to hear if you have any specific insights on how can we, let's say, leverage innovation also in the future, and whether on the EU side and the US side, there is also a conversation on how to make these innovative instruments work in one or the other context. So I know this is, again, a lot. So if you would like me to repeat any part of the questions, I'd be happy to do so. Maybe we can start from Sarah Cross and Adam Manter, then move to the other speakers. I don't know whether, okay, perfect. Over to you.
Thanks, Silvia. I'll start and hand over to Adam. And I'd like to first take on the first question you posed about the sponsorship program. And I think the question was about whether it would be open to non-Ukrainians. And I just want to say, absolutely, we are super excited about our plans to launch a program that will be available to refugees from all nationalities. And indeed, one of President Biden's very first acts in office was to put an executive order out that instructed us not only to rebuild and restore our US refugee admissions program and modernize it, but also to modernize it in particular through more community-led approaches, including a private sponsorship pilot program that we are developing to launch later this year. So this, the Ukraine response and before that, the response to Afghans has really accelerated those efforts and shown all the potential. And as you just said, really given us an opportunity to innovate in this space as we prepare to launch this program. And even just listening to Adam describe the U4U program, which I'm familiar with, I'm just amazed again at just how much innovation has happened in such a short amount of time by our colleagues at DHS. So it's just a really exciting opportunity. But as I said, we have long been planning to launch a new private sponsorship program later this year. And the intention all along has been for it to be available to all refugees coming through the US Refugee Admissions Program from all nationalities. I think we welcome something like 85 nationalities, or have over time, that many nationalities. So the intention is for it to be broadly available, and we'll be launching it in 2 phases. The first phase will be to match refugees who are already in our pipeline with those who, on the US side, as Adam is saying, there's a demand-driven process and quite a lot of interest that we've seen. So in the first phase, individuals will be able to be matched with refugees already in the pipeline. And then in the second phase, we'll have an identification component whereby individuals, groups, universities in the US can identify particular refugees to refer to the US Refugee Admissions Program, again, anywhere in the world. So that is very much our intention, but it has been just a truly extraordinary opportunity in the past year to really test the theory that the president had in his executive order, which was that if given the opportunity, Americans would raise their hands and take on the opportunity to lead in resettling refugees. And we've seen it just overwhelmingly, first in response to the Afghan arrivals and now in response to Ukrainians. It's required us to work outside of our normal, resettlement program, but it's again created opportunities for us to experiment and try new ways to add what is now a really exciting new protection tool. So U4U, which is entirely new, really adds to our protection toolbox in exciting ways, and it will not, I think, in any way, diminish our commitment to welcoming the 125,000 refugees that we are aspiring to resettle this year and beyond through our very ambitious presidential ceiling. So I think that we will continue to grow our sponsorship programs. We will continue to resettle as many refugees as possible throughout all regions of the globe, alongside our efforts to build the sponsorship piece into the resettlement program and build on these complementary pathways that DHS and others are experimenting with and really innovating around. So maybe I'll stop there and see if Adam wants to add anything to that.
Thanks, Sarah. Just a couple brief words to supplement. I think it's worth recalling, our ability to resettle refugees and the entire infrastructure is a literal public-private partnership between the U.S. government, state governments, and private actors. And much of that infrastructure, to be frank, had been pretty well decimated in recent years. So we were starting in this administration well below the baseline in terms of our capacity to really meet these higher refugee resettlement goals. So over the course of our work, I think with the Afghan evacuation and with Uniting for Ukraine, we've recognized that there is not necessarily a singular pathway. There are multiple tools that we can employ to address challenges and particular circumstances, and each one has their own statutory bounds, maybe some of their own benefits and other limitations as a toolkit, as it were, to bring to bear. But we've also been able to innovate in how we are operationalizing programs, and in particular, I want to underscore also on the resettlement side, building back that necessary capacity and also enhancing our ability to process cases more timely. And we're learning a lot of lessons real time in the Afghan context right now that we intend to employ also in other regions of the world. And it's my agency and DHS that actually sends the officers, the decision makers, to interview cases in support of our State Department colleagues. So I think the latest innovations that we are doing in Uniting for Ukraine on some of the technology side that are very new, work in a particular context for a particular reason and have particular bounds, but do provide impetus to the range of the possible. And I think as we learn better how to make our hard and fast and trusted tools more efficient, the range of technologies and innovations that we can employ in administering those tools, our intention in this administration is to bring the best of all of these elements together so that we can have the most flexible, responsive, and where needed, the durable pathways that we know are so sorely needed when we're facing 100 million people who are displaced around the world.
Many thanks, both. Looking at the other speakers to see if anyone else wants to react also from the youth perspective. Giulio or Sophie, for example, please feel free to unmute yourselves.
Well, I mean, in terms of what we will carry forward from this crisis, and I think we started to touch upon beforehand, there is a lot that we are structuring, and I think Sophie or Imogen before were flagging in particular the issue and the questions around guidance and guidelines and applicability of guidelines for this kind of situations. And I think there is a lot of that will come with us, also on digitalization and the work we have been doing to establish the registration platform for Ukrainians under the Ukrainians, for persons fleeing Ukraine under the Temporary Protection Directive, and all of the need, I mean, for instance, to digitalize residence permits in the context of such a large crisis where it's very difficult for member states to be swiftly issuing millions of residence permits. So we are considering how can we digitalize those permits as well. So there is a lot of lessons learned that I think we will be able to carry forward, both in terms of legislation implementation for the future, tools, and in a way, innovations that we are identifying as we go.
Many thanks, Giulio, and looking forward if maybe UNHCR also have any comments on this, and also, for example, on the digitalization and innovations perspective, but of course also on really the potential for these new tools to be used to benefit broader populations.
Thank you very much, Silvia. I mean, just briefly on the digital opportunities question. Yes, I think what we've seen in the response to Ukrainian refugees in the EU is a range of very interesting, innovative solutions. One being, of course, the establishment of a registration platform for all Ukrainian refugees across the EU, but others being, I suppose, because it's such a specific situation with Ukraine, engagement with Ukraine itself to see what synergies there can be between digital tools within the EU and digital tools in Ukraine. Prior to the war, and still, Ukraine has been a leader in bringing in digital products for their citizens to access social services. And they have an app at the moment where Ukrainian citizens can access a whole range of digital ID through the app and also social services. So I think this is really fertile ground for us to see how EU and non-EU countries can work together to try and put in place digital solutions that will assist and help refugees. And perhaps one of the things about the scale and speed of this crisis is that it's forced us to deal with some very important data protection issues and to try and deal with those quickly so that we can put in place products that are going to support and help Ukrainian refugees. In simple terms, Ukrainian refugees have a right to move within the European Union, and we need to make sure that if they move from one state to another, they can access services, they can access ID. And it's also important for us in the larger UN plan of not leaving anyone behind, that digital inclusion of refugees and displaced people is key. And we think there's a lot we can build on from this crisis. Just briefly on the other question that somebody posed in relation to resettlement and the availability of these tools for displaced persons beyond Ukraine. Next year, we will estimate that 2 million refugees globally are in dire need of resettlement because they cannot integrate where they are and they can't access durable solutions. So the global resettlement program is really focusing on those refugees that can't find solutions where they are, and that's where we need to maintain that focus. It's important to come up with additional solutions and support for Ukrainian refugees, but when it comes to resettlement, our focus is on those refugees globally, on the African continent and elsewhere, particularly in the Middle East, where those resettlement solutions are needed. And we're going to have a very important opportunity on the 1st of July at the next Resettlement Forum hosted by the Commission to again try and, together with states, refocus our efforts on global resettlement. It's a lot to manage this and the Ukraine crisis, but we believe, particularly with the key support of our partners in the US and Canada and the UK, that we can get there. Thanks very much.
Many thanks. And quickly looking also at Mary and Imogen to see if they have any additional remarks, because if not, maybe we can have a last round of questions. But I see, Mary, you'd like to come in. Please, over to you.
I'll keep it very brief. I think every humanitarian crisis is unique. And each time Canada learns, something to respond effectively or to try and respond effectively. So I think it's very important to think about not only how we can be innovative in this space, but as you mentioned, how do we draw lessons from previous crises? And I think even more importantly, how do we work between the spaces when things get a little quieter? I think we should be thinking medium and longer term in terms of, I provide as an example the work on community sponsorship, which really came from the community, from the society at a time of crisis. We learned from that and we brought it forward. I would say the same thing about the Syrian crisis, some of the lessons learned there when we welcomed a large number of people to Canada in terms of scaling up and otherwise that we were able to bring forward. So really effective, but I would say it's really hard to carve out time right now to think beyond the immediate. But I think in many of the platforms and initiatives and then the collaboration that we have, I think that that's an important component and to reach back into our own experiences in response and to bring forward some of those learnings. So certainly in our response, although, our authorization that I spoke of was something new and we had the opportunity to innovate in regards to other parts of our response, we were really able to draw on previous experiences. So something that I think we need to think of not only now, but build into forward plans, as Giulio said, to create that protection space and that continued solidarity in terms of collaboration.
Many thanks. And looking at Imogen, if you want to have a last say on this question.
Thank you. So just for the in the interest of completion, I also wanted to add, just as we were speaking about the digital tools. I know that in EPC you've done so much work on the importance of information sharing and also the risks of disinformation at the moment. And so from the civil society side as well, I think it's been a real spur, both this crisis and building from other humanitarian situations, to really develop tools which are responsive to the needs of the communities that we work with, available in multiple languages, and that really provide access or signpost to the services rather than providing the actual digital hubs to the services as the states do. And as the other speakers were mentioning, we also have been developing a service called Signpost, which is now available in 16 different countries. And it's really technology empowered to enable communities to lead in providing indications of information that is lacking and that they need, and then really signposting and ensuring that they have access to the needs in the countries where they are. And as we're looking at fair responsibility sharing across different member states in the EU, and we know that there are still challenges in kind of incentivizing the take up in some countries that are willing to host but aren't receiving the refugees, providing information on the rights and the situation that they can expect to find in those countries can be really important through tools like that one.
Many thanks. So I'll move quickly because I received another question through the chat, and maybe we can have 1 more minute for each speaker to also reply and add any conclusive remarks you might have. So the question concerns actually the fact that Ukrainians have now several options in terms of pathways to protection, either staying in the EU or potentially, of course, finding a sponsor across other states. So the question is whether, and Sophie briefly touched upon this point, and how the EU and the US are balancing the investment in transfers and protection versus rebuilding infrastructure in Ukraine, but also more broadly, of course, considering the possibility that these people might come back. And in other words, so how are you balancing priorities? And then maybe one last point that I think it would be very interesting to touch upon concerns the availability of legal pathways, because of course, one of the main differences that you have seen in respect to the displacement from Ukraine is that people could easily cross the borders to the EU, but also that they have facilitated travel to the US or Canada potentially. So I was wondering, and I think the example of Uniting for Ukraine is particularly fitting, basically how has this transition worked so far? And in particular, thinking of the southern border of the US, what have you seen since Uniting for Ukraine has been introduced? And to what extent do you think that providing this sort of safe pathways could also basically work for other nationalities? And maybe we can have a last round of comments, again, starting from Sarah and then closing with Imogen. But please also, if you have any final remark you would like to make, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I might just kick it over to Adam first if he wants to talk about the particularities of Uniting for Ukraine and the border, and then I'll come in on top of that. Thanks.
Sure thing. Happy to say a couple of words here. As we've stressed before, right, there are multiple viable pathways for Ukrainians to come to the US now. We did see shortly after the invasion a growing population of Ukrainians in Mexico, and we, together with Mexican colleagues as well as our State Department friends in Mexico, coordinated on an effort to ensure that we could, on a temporary basis, receive those Ukrainians and also consider them for parole. There were just over 20,000, I think, total in that pool. Since we have announced Uniting for Ukraine, that has been the primary process by which Ukrainians have been arriving. And the Mexico population had been largely processed. There were some remaining individuals who were getting assistance and processing through Uniting for Ukraine. And I think that the population is almost entirely, at least those that our embassy colleagues were tracking, been provided for. So it was really an effort in standing up Uniting for Ukraine for a lot of reasons, but one of the benefits of having the direct ability to travel from whatever location Ukrainians were in to the United States is it obviated the need for a more uncertain, irregular route. Just by way of some numbers, since March 24th, we have welcomed more than 9,000 Ukrainians entering as immigrants, so with permanent residency for their initial entry. About 20,000 temporary Ukrainian visa holders. As I mentioned, the about 20,000 paroles that we did, of the group of Ukrainians at the southwest border, and nearly 300 refugees just in that limited period. And then on top of that, the new Uniting for Ukraine process, where those numbers are ramping up, even in recent days, we're looking at about 9,000. So as you can see, there's kind of multiple pathways that are, depending on circumstances, depending on availability, depending on documentation. If somebody has a visa already in their passport, for example, that Ukrainians are able to avail themselves in this moment and make decisions about how and when to enter and where to go, frankly, whether it's to the United States or to other countries.
Many thanks. And mindful of the time, I would ask you to keep your final comments brief, checking if Sarah Krause has any final maybe comment or any addition to make.
No, I'll just quickly make 2 points. One is on the point of information sharing that Imogen mentioned. And yes, I think, I'm not sure how many people are aware, but we are in very intensive conversations with our Canadian and British colleagues together with IOM about this information sharing challenge and helping Ukrainians navigate the many multiple pathways and what the eligibility and the processes are for each of them. And we understand that that's an information challenge that we need to address. Similarly, there's an information challenge on our side, and I think many of our governments have struggled to really get a handle on what Ukrainians are planning, what the demand would be for these pathways, and how long individuals would plan to stay in these countries. And so it has been a difficult process of trying to plan the right kinds of responses to this particular moment, but I think we've made great progress on that. I think that just the last point I was going to say is that on the question of balancing priorities is, from my perspective, the fact that we were able to launch U4U so quickly and get it stood up really enabled us to preserve the space to maintain and preserve the priority that we also have around global refugee resettlement and hitting the higher numbers that we've aspired to, while also rebuilding our program so that we can maintain that high level of commitment for the future. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Many thanks to you, and moving to Giulio to see whether you have any additional comments on the balancing act that needs to be done, or also on legal pathways.
Indeed, but I think, I would very much align with what Sarah was saying from several perspectives. First and foremost, the introduction of the Temporary Protection Directive, one of its goals is actually to preserve the space for asylum at large. So one of the goals of the TPD is to avoid that our asylum systems become overwhelmed with asylum applications from Ukraine, and as a consequence, reduce the protection space for other nationalities because the systems can't cope. And I think that extends also to the resettlement space, as many of our countries actually have resettlement system that foresee the persons to arrive and then to lodge an asylum application. And actually, by activating the TPD, we have continued to preserve that possibility. And indeed, the intention is to continue investing in the space of resettlement and the rest of the pathways, to the point that it's not by coincidence that the Commission has adopted its legal migration package at the same time as the Ukrainian crisis was at its height, confirming once again that we see the importance of maintaining and keeping open channels of different kinds. We're really grateful for the leadership of Canada of the Labour Migration Task Force as well. This is a work around labor, the connections between labor and refugees and resettlement is something that we really also want to pursue actively. So overall, I would say there is the intention to look ahead of the crisis, but not the crisis overwhelm our systems of protection. That's exactly why we activated the TPD, and we are proud of the response we've been providing so far.
Many thanks. So handing over to Sophie.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Imogen raised a very important point about funding trickling down to NGOs and regional actors. And we've already seen that of the 17 billion in the care package announced by the EU, 3.5 million has been dispersed. And there's a good list of the countries to which that money has been dispersed on the Commission's website on Ukraine refugee response. I think it is going to be a challenge to try and make sure that that money does reach the NGOs and regional actors concerned. And perhaps this is also an area where some good practice or some advocacy from our international partners can help as well. It's a feature of emergency money that will be dispersed quickly to states that sometimes it's difficult for that trickling down to happen. So I think we all need to be very mindful for that and keep in mind that the costs that have been incurred for temporary protection are often at the very local level, private households, local regions, etc. So that's a key concern. And then also on the question that was in the chat box as well about the cooperation with Hungary. I think the numbers of people that have been welcomed into Hungary have been well reflected in UNHCR's data portal, where we share statistics on those numbers, and we've seen some impressive numbers of Ukrainian refugees that have entered into Hungary, and also Hungary was very quick to put in place a temporary protection regime. Perhaps one of the innovations we can look at as well is that we have seen that there has been quite a high degree of onward movement of Ukrainian refugees, which has been supported and facilitated by EU member states. That's, something that would have been unthinkable prior to the 24th of February, that onward movement would be incentivized. But a lot of time has gone into supporting that. And I hope that maybe we can learn some of the good lessons that have come from supporting the agency of refugees to go to a place where they can establish themselves and integrate within a temporary protection regime that's common across the states. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to you. So some final remarks, maybe from Mary and Imogen before we close. Only if you would like to, of course.
No, of course. Thank you again. It's been an incredibly interesting conversation. I might add, just building on some of the earlier comments, individuals are facing, really difficult personal decisions right now as we head, and I'm speaking here primarily about Ukrainians, as we head into the summer season, thinking about, school, the start of school. As we mentioned, we're now at 100 days, reevaluating. And I think what's really important is just the quality of the information that's being provided. Sophie spoke to blue dots. I know ourselves in a Canadian context, we're trying to increase our capacity in terms of having a presence in Warsaw to be able to provide information, dedicated service channels early on in our response. So I would say, it's really important and valuable to have many services, many different types of programs. We've seen a lot of innovation, but I think we always need to keep coming back to those individual decisions, and that people have, good information and evidence in making some really difficult decisions over the coming months. And certainly Canada stands ready to welcome individuals if they so choose to come to Canada. But, again, people have this opportunity to choose, I think, unprecedented, and making sure they have the right information, I think, is especially important.
Many thanks. So one last word to Imogen.
Thank you, Silvia. Just very briefly, I'd like just to stress, if we're looking at how to apply best practice from this emergency to asylum seekers and refugees elsewhere in Europe and from other refugee-producing countries, I think both in the EU negotiations underway and in the day-to-day implementation of existing EU law, I would just stress yet again how we are strongly relying on the European Commission to continue its commitment to uphold access to protection and strongly speak out against rights violations at EU borders, to ensure that we are both upholding the access to full and fair asylum systems, and also speaking out against any kind of limitations, which we know asylum, alongside building up really much more ambitious resettlement commitments, will be so important to ensure that the kind of lessons that we've really seen working in this response can also help other refugees from equally pressing crises as well.
Many thanks, and very mindful of the time. I would like to thank you all once again for your contributions. You have really made this a very lively debate, and I would really be curious to see in 6 months' time and in 1 year's time what is going to happen after the resettlement fora and with the continuation of all these very interesting initiatives. So hopefully we will have other occasions to gather together. And I would also invite you, of course, to follow EPC, because we will certainly continue working around these topics. But thanks again to all of the speakers. Thanks to our partners at the US mission that have really contributed at all stages in the preparation of this event. And of course, many thanks to colleagues at the EPC that have supported the organization of this policy dialogue. And with this, I wish you all a very good afternoon or a very good rest of the day for our US guests. Many thanks again.